Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Mooney, and I'm the project lead of the Community Knowledge Program here at Wellesley Institute. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge the land on which Wellesley Institute operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. Welcome to our first panel for 2024. The Community Knowledge Program aims to encourage collaborative research and knowledge sharing within the immigrant and refugee serving sector in the Greater Toronto Area. Funded by the United Way, we work to fill existing gaps in how researchers, policymakers, and community agencies collaborate to conduct research and apply its findings to frontline work with newcomers, as well as to policy affecting newcomers. We conducted a needs assessment in 2021 to understand the gaps. One way that we are addressing them is through panel discussions, such as this one, to convene leaders from different parts of the sector to speak about their experiences and perspectives on research and knowledge mobilization. Over the past 4 years, the Community Knowledge Program has been considering how to promote settlement research and evidence-based practice in frontline work with newcomers. We've looked at successes and challenges. We have begun building capacity in the sector through our public webinars and trainings for frontline workers, and a new community of practice to support researchers, practitioners, and others engaged in supporting newcomers to our area. Today's panelists will discuss what they've learned through their work with LGBTQIA+ newcomers, including the unique challenges they may face settling in Canada. Our guests will also discuss how their settlement research has influenced changes to frontline services for LGBTQIA+ community members in the GTA. Before we get to the speakers, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping notes. Please keep in mind this webinar is being recorded. The video and transcript will be available on our website next week. If you need subtitles, you can enable live transcription by going to the meeting controls at the top of the screen and select more options, then language and speech, and then turn on live captions. Please note that the chat function is enabled for this event, but we encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions to make sure that we don't miss them. We're going to start with our panelists' presentations, and then we will come back together for questions afterwards. We have two wonderful panelists that we will hear from today. First, we will hear from Dr. David Kinitz. David is a social and behavioral health scientist, social worker, and postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University School of Medicine. He uses qualitative and mixed methods research approaches to critically deconstruct socio-political and economic structures that impact 2S LGBTQ+ mental health. David's research is primarily focused on employment and how 2S LGBTQ+ people's outcomes are shaped by cis heterosexism, racism, and ableism, among other systems of oppression. Next, we will hear from Ranjith Kula-Tilake. Ranjith is the coordinator of the Rainbow Connect LGBTQ+ Newcomer Support Program at TNG Community Services in Toronto. For his work over the past decade, he received the 2021 City of Toronto Access, Equity, and Human Rights Pride Award. He's a member of the City of Toronto's 2S LGBTQ+ Council Advisory Body and an advisory committee member of Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants Positive Spaces Initiative. He holds both bachelor's and master's degrees in social work. Ranjith is also a PhD student in social work, focusing on LGBTQ resettlement in settler colonial Canada. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. I hope you are as well. Let's get started with Dr. David Kinitz.
Thank you, Emily. I'm just going to go ahead and try to share my screen here. Which I need to do in my systems. see. So are you seeing the first slide?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So if something doesn't advance, if it seems like I'm talking to something that is not on the screen, please feel free to interrupt. Hello, good morning from California. Good afternoon to you. Looking forward to today's discussion and learning more. So I'm going to present a high-level overview of some highlights related to settlement stories of gay, bisexual, and queer men in Toronto. And this presentation is not so much a robust analysis, but more a starting place to engage in conversation today. So I look forward to the discussion. And this presentation comes from a larger study among gay, bisexual, and queer men, which was my dissertation, focused on domestic and immigrants and refugees who are precariously employed. A little bit of background on the topic of work in minority groups is that low quality and precarious employment is on the rise, which means that employers have more power than workers. And so low quality and precarious employment, importantly, disproportionately impacts immigrants and refugees, people of color, as well as LGBTQ plus people. So hostile social attitudes and limited policy protections for LGBT people globally makes Canada an attractive or viable destination. But unfortunately, the Canadian economy depends on immigrant and refugees to occupy jobs in our labor market that are most exploitative. And given that immigrants and refugees encounter numerous barriers to settlement and employment in particular, that can lead to economic insecurity and labor market precarity. So my objective today is to discuss barriers to settlement specific to gay, bisexual, and queer immigrants and refugees who are precariously employed in Toronto, and as well just provide a starting point for further conversation. So this research, as I said, comes from my doctoral work that was in partnership with the Neighborhood Group and their employment services that they offer there. I also conducted qualitative interviews, and this was about coming up to 2 years ago now that I collected the data, but I haven't finished the analysis on all the immigrant and refugee data. Participant inclusion for this study were sexual minority men, 30 years old and up, living or working in Toronto, who are actively experiencing precarious employment. So that's my study flyer there that I shared on social media through the Neighborhood Group and other employment services and LGBT services. The sample that I'm focused on is 13 newcomers and immigrants and refugees out of the 21 participants. About a third of those participants identified as trans or non-binary, and about 2/3 as racialized. And participants also identified with diverse sexual orientations and genders, such as agender, cisgender, transgender, pansexual, etc. So I'm just going to share some excerpts of participant stories related to their search for safety and reasons for coming to Canada, followed by barriers to settlement, experiences in the workplace, and briefly acts of resistance and agency demonstrated by newcomers. Given our short time today, I've also put on quotes on the slides that I'll speak to but not read explicitly. So you'll likely not have time to read them yourselves in the moment, but please feel free to take a photo or go back later in the recording next week when it's online. As these quotes are more so to just illustrate that though I was active in what I'm highlighting today, this summary comes from the stories of participants. So in terms of participants and why they came to Canada as immigrants or refugees, they came for various reasons, primarily related to their safety because of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, but also due to war or civil unrest, as well as finding better opportunities. So the majority of participants told stories about coming to Canada as immigrants or refugees because they were either not safe in their home country or wanted to be in a country where they could live more authentically, such as accessing gender-affirming care and surgery. A few barriers to settlement that I identified were having limited opportunities in the labor market, mental health challenges, facing financial insecurity, being exploited in the labor market, as well as having questions about safety and knowledge of support services offered here in the GTA. So I'll touch base on each one of these areas. With regard to the limited opportunities in the labor market, most participants were highly educated with ample work experience related to the jobs that they were applying to. However, they shared that they had their experiences and credentials dismissed as not relevant to the Canadian job market. And they also suspected discrimination related to that, such as xenophobia related to their name on their resume, their accent in interviews, or the country that their education was from. Further, some participants selected to limit their opportunities for safety, such as only working in settings where they felt they might be safer, such as a nonprofit organization, but those positions were often contract and lower paying and insecure. Mental health also impacted participants' settlement journeys. So across most participant stories were discussions of past trauma in their home countries, as well as mental health challenges that impacted participants' interpersonal relationships, opportunities for work, ability to navigate supports and services, as well as all other aspects of their life. So their past trauma and mental health was also exacerbated by the economic insecurity and precarious employment they would face. I will also say that I can hear if a thing comes on to the chat, but please feel free to interrupt because I won't be able to see the chat. Seemingly most prevalent among participant stories was about financial insecurity or having financial security. So some participants talked about prioritizing immigration for safety to be more themselves, but they didn't realize how many barriers they would face, mainly naming poverty and economic insecurity, once they came to Canada. So money was a primary concern for participants that exacerbated all other aspects of their life. Participants expressed pleading with Ontario Works and other services to help them get a job or give them some money to get them started so that they could become stable. But unfortunately, there were limited financial supports available to newcomers. This left people vulnerable to credit card scams, going into debt, as well as predatory temp agencies where they would never be able to pay back and afford things like rent when a lot of their money was going back to those temp agencies. Participants also had concerns around accessing social welfare programs for fear it would impact their permanent residency and citizenship applications. So a lot of participants, though they might have been able to access Ontario Works, they didn't want to because they thought it might have ramifications later on. So the financial stress, mental health challenges, and decredentialing that I've named so far have left newcomers vulnerable to exploitation, a clear failure of immigration policies and capitalism. Participants spoke about how the limited opportunities due to racism, xenophobia, transphobia, and others left them vulnerable to take low-paying positions where they did not have the power or agency to address unfair practices or workplace harassment. Similarly, this other participant explains that he will accept poor treatment or exploitation because he was dependent on the job he has. And he's not just dependent on it for himself, but to send money back home to his family. So participants discussed experiences of sexual assault, not being paid for the jobs that they did, being told that they need to work for free or volunteer to get that first job, as well as other types of exploitation and abuse. As well, related to safe services, many participants did not know where to go to access safe support and took to online forums and referrals to find social services. So some participants were unsure if newcomer services would be safe for LGBT people because of the values of their home countries of others accessing those services as well as other nonprofits, often religious-based with saint or Catholic in their name, that made participants question how welcoming they might be of LGBTQ people. Participants did note, though, that seeing queer representation in social services helped participants build trust, as did seeing other immigrant representation in the social service providers, as they had shared experiences and had empathy for their situation. They could also have informal conversations around what are taxes and those kinds of things that might not have been the case and more of a surprise upon coming to Canada. So that's some of the barriers to settlement. But for me, I study work and labor. So in the workplace, I also want to talk about how participants hid their sexual orientation and gender identity, worked in certain sectors that might feel safer, also about the interpersonal conflict related to racism and xenophobia and understanding Western expectations, as well as the informal work that a lot of people went into due to nepotism. So many participants would hide their sexual orientation and or gender identity, explaining that they already were discriminated based on so many factors, such as their race or their accent. And why would they want to add another aspect of discrimination? So other participants, though, also felt that being open about their sexual orientation or gender identity was important for them. So it's not all participants hid their sexual orientations or genders, but at the same time, it was one way that participants took some agency and were able to reduce the amount of discrimination they would face. In terms of informal work and nepotism, I think this is an important part of finding work. Due to the hostility of the labor market, several participants were only able to find work through their informal networks of others from the same cultural group, such as cleaning services run by a Spanish-speaking organization. Sometimes these workplaces were informal, such as working without contracts or working under the table for cash, and employers and employees had cultural values that participants had left in their home countries because of safety. So because of that, then they weren't able to be out, and the reasons that they came to Canada to live more authentically and safe were no longer relevant. Importantly, though, there are a lot of barriers to participants' experiences of settlement. Amidst these stories of struggle, participants provided many examples where they were exerted agency, resistance, and strength through their everyday settlement practices, such as they formed communities of support, navigated systems in strategic ways, such as getting their financial needs met, while not always following the specific routes that are supposed to be. They accepted challenges of settlement as temporary, so throughout their stories, they still had a lot of hope underlining a lot of their stories. And they also found low-income supports for material and health, so things like such as free therapy or food banks and those kinds of things. So they were able to navigate the systems to meet their needs when they're financially insecure. So this participant, though I'm not going to be able to read it, talks about how they make it their mission to help others navigate settlement processes. So they form communities of support even before they arrive in Canada, and then as well upon entering Canada, being translators for people who don't speak the language and other things like that in all the different processes that people have to go through. So some conclusions for me, I was interested that homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia were very active in people's home countries, but was less focal once they arrived in Canada. And that's because of the high rates of, xenophobia, racism. This is why I shouldn't go off my notes, sorry. So homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia were not as prevalent here in Canada because people were more worried about their safety related to xenophobia, racism that were more prevalent. So racism and xenophobia were the primary barriers to settling and employment here in Canada. As well, it's important to note that deregulation of the labor market and increased austerity measures means fewer protections for workers with limited safety nets, such as basic income to fall back on. So Ontario Works and those kinds of programs are well insufficient to support people living out of poverty. So those kinds of austerity measures are not going to be supportive for LGBT newcomers who are particularly vulnerable to exploitation and inadequate services. A little bit of what we can do as a result. We can advocate at the structural level for increased social welfare programming, such as Ontario Works or OSP or some sort of basic income. Increased supports for newcomers, so financial, also securing housing, mental health care, finding education and work equivalencies so that people can get jobs and be eligible for those jobs, as well as advocate for fair processes related to permanent residency and citizenship that is not dependent on contributing to society, so such as volunteering or not accessing social welfare programming. At the individual level, we need to support finding safe and stable employment. So not just sending people to different employers just because they need a job, because those jobs might not be safe for a lot of people, specifically LGBT newcomers. We need to address people's needs holistically. So here in the Greater Toronto Area, we really silo our different services. So you might be able to get employment supports, but those employment supports don't address your mental health and your wellness overall. You're still living in poverty and experiencing mental health crisis while trying to find stable employment, and vice versa. People are trying to access safer and better mental health care while also being precariously employed and financially insecure, which is not a good way to support our mental health. So we need to integrate supports and address things more holistically. We also need to ensure all spaces are safe for LGBT people, and that's particularly among newcomer services because participants are worried that others accessing newcomer services might have the same hostile or discriminatory values of the culture they left in their home countries. And we also need to educate ourselves and as well newcomers about the different systems here in Canada, such as unions. A lot of people are like, what is a union? How do I get in one? Exploitative companies like credit cards or temp agencies that result in people getting into more and more debt, as well as on the systems like how to navigate Ontario Works and other systems like that, and taxes, etc. So I've presented this work to different organizations, including the neighborhood group and the different employment supports that they offer and the employment coaches. And we're trying to create more inclusive services. We're working on getting more LGBT employment services within the Greater Toronto Area as well, which will hopefully be more informed than mainstream services that might not be safe for either newcomers or LGBT people. There are a variety of newcomer services, but they aren't necessarily supportive for LGBT people. So we're trying to inform the services that exist, as well as create new services that will be more supportive of all LGBT newcomers. So I put my email there. I'm going to hand it over to Ranjith, but I'll also say that there are also others working in this space who are highly productive and publishing in these areas. So if you want for educating yourself and also learning more about the experiences of LGBT newcomers, I've put one of Roya's papers there, Nicola's papers there, my paper that this data is from is on the bottom there. So there is a fair bit of research going on in this area, and it's slowly expanding in Canada. So I'll just say that's a nice silver lining to see it continuing, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Ranjith.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Okay, I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Ah, okay. Oh. I was able to share it before. Can you now?
Yes.
Okay. Right, so it's working and researching with LGBTQ plus newcomers. It's researching with, that's my topic today. So this is a quick check-in for you to have a mental picture or write down your response. A quote: I am amazed by the incredible resilience of LGBTQIA plus newcomers. Please note down your response: yes, no, maybe, not sure. You don't have to share it with anybody. We will revisit this quote again. So who are LGBTQIA plus newcomers? They're not a monolithic entity. And so they range from asylum seekers to non-status people, refugee claimants, convention refugees, permanent residents, and new Canadians. The question is what makes them leave their home countries? And they're still fully human. So that is something we need to really, really understand. These are some of the learning objectives today: to disrupt cis heteronormative research and practices that propel settler colonialism, to understand the interlocking systems of oppression affecting LGBTQIA plus newcomers, to provide insights for reflexive research and practice. Now I'm going to read all this. No, I'm not going to read this. But what I want to highlight is the importance of researcher positionalities. And this is a snapshot of where I came from and what I have gone through as a gay man fled from Sri Lanka. So from the beginning to where I am now towards the end, and I landed in this geography now we call Canada, without realizing that that is where settler colonialism is fully in force, and Indigenous peoples are facing settler colonialism head on. So this is some of my work. Okay, what I want to say here is the importance of situating myself and my work on the stolen land of indigenous peoples. So on the one hand, there are refugee queer producing geographies. They're being lured to with the safe haven branding. And the end result is the Canadian homonationalist citizen who are then implicated in the genocide of First Peoples. I talk about indigenous peoples and these terms with utmost respect and care, and from my with the commitment to be an eternal learner and to work on the justice for centering indigenous peoples. So this is that whole ladder to the safe haven. So there's safe haven carrot on the one hand to LGBTQ plus refugees and newcomers, and then there is settler colonization on this land. So recolonization versus settler colonization. So this is what I'm looking at in my doctoral research right now. So this is a quick snapshot of the world, sexual orientation laws in the world. I'm not going to read all this, but how it is tied to the legacy of colonialism, especially British colonialism, and the neo-colonial invasions all over the African continent and elsewhere. So homosexuality is punishable by death. Death penalty may be enforced in certain countries, criminalization, and you see that quite a lot of so-called Commonwealth countries are enforcing criminalization of sexual orientation and gender identity laws. So I'm going to post some snapshots to disrupt our thinking. So this is from Sherry Wolf, who says, it took more than 2 decades after the advent of the homosexual before medical doctors began to write about the heterosexual. Modern bourgeois ideology assumes that we need not trace the genealogy of heterosexuality because it must be a timeless concept and practice. But just as homosexuality was invented, so too was heterosexuality. Something to think about in our practice and in our research. Disrupt number 2, especially for researchers. The term data in its origins mean gift. This means we must ask, who owns the data? And what does ownership mean? Potts and Brown, 2015, and page 27, Research as Resistance, that's the book. So for LGBTIQ plus newcomers, immigration status is tied to their essential services. It's a deep, very steep ladder. They are grouped into various so-called categories: non-status asylum seekers, refugee claimants, convention refugees, permanent residents, and new Canadian citizens. This data is based on basically Ontario. This is where I mentioned Ontario Works and so on. So if you're a non-state asylum seeker, these are the crucial stages of their lives when they come to Canada. Early on, they don't have virtually no access to healthcare. There are few agencies that provide some healthcare, but within the system there is no access to healthcare. So the ladder goes on, and these are tied to their immigration status. So access to critical support systems is tied to their immigration statuses. That is what I want to highlight here. And resettlement stresses faced by LGBTQ plus newcomers. Their life being put on hold indefinitely, culture shocks, climate is a huge shock, resettlement stresses, intricate navigation of systems. They face greater risks if refugee claims fail. The refugee claim process re-traumatizes them, as well as they are being outed because they have to constantly look for evidence from back home, and they have to get involved in various programs here, and that process quite a lot of the time out them to the unknown. And if their claims failed and if they are sent back, they face greater risks. Yes, and not finding LGBTQ plus refugee support systems, having to overwork. This is so rampant. They have to overwork. They constantly 2-3 jobs, and in the end getting sick, physical and mental health issues and related. So these are some of the social determinants of health, forms of oppression. I don't call racism without pronouncing white supremacy. Racism is an outcome of white supremacy. Poverty is an outcome of capitalism. So these are some of the forms of oppression. And they lead to impacts: social isolation, alienation, social invisibility, displacement, low self-esteem, self-denial, poverty, underemployment, disenfranchisement, guilt, shame, fear, spiritual deprivation, and so on. And they lead to vulnerabilities: lack of appropriate social services, anxiety, stress, suicidal ideations, food insecurity, mental health issues, sexual risk-taking, delayed seeking of healthcare and treatment, exclusion from health promotion, and unchecked exploitation by the market. So these are the vulnerabilities created by the forms of systemic oppressions, and they lead to unmet needs of health and well-being. High rates of PTSD, anxiety disorders, disenfranchised grief, and that's a whole different area of focus, disenfranchised grief, which I can talk if there is more time. High rates of violence, unmet healthcare needs leading to long-term health conditions. Okay, so reflexive practice and research, they are reciprocal. So they come, LGBTIQ plus newcomers come to Canada with expectations of a safe haven, but their experiences are really, really different. Not the expectations that they have come for. Transphobia, homophobia from their straight or own ethno-racial straight communities, and then racism from the mainstream LGBTIQ plus communities. They live in poverty, social isolation is rampant, unsafe housing, access to housing is a massive issue, lack of access to equitable healthcare and education, precarious employment, and many more. So for those who are working in the field, the scenario is this, that your clients' experiences should minimally meet their expectations, but usually it should exceed their expectations if you are working with them. This is same for research as well, and some clues can be taken into your research domains. And again, reflexive practice and research. Self-reflexivity is so important. Power and privilege you gain as a researcher or service provider. You need to ask questions. Are you explicitly or implicitly transphobic, homophobic, racist, ableist, ageist, and so on? And are you an agent of a sick system or an agent of a positive change? And please do not merely focus on their resilience when the systems are sick and oppressive, and understand the many forms of stereotyping and otherings and the damages they do. Do not treat LGBTIQ plus newcomers as exotic subjects. Learn from your clients. Consider them as your experts. Step number 3, restore and reboot your learner's stance. So my clients, the people I have been working with, are my teachers. They are the experts. I'm learning from them. And I also bring my own positionalities into the equation. So it's this constant reflexive dialogue that is so important when providing services. Number 4, this is a truly amazing quote. I use this quote quite often, which says, is schizophrenia always a sick response to a healthy society? Or can schizophrenia be seen as a healthy response to a sick society? So it is the reversal of our thinking. Remember, it's important to remember, trauma is a normal response to unhealthy or abnormal situations. Number 5, how is it that your or our efforts to liberate through our practice and research perpetuate the relations of dominance, exclusion, and violence? These are the questions to constantly ask. And when I do work, it is usually, it's based on trauma-informed practices, strength-based. I use strength-based practices. However, being very mindful not to ignore or invalidate the client's struggles. When you talk about strength-based, it doesn't mean that you ignore if a client is exhausted and doesn't want to talk about any strengths they have, and validate, stay there. That is why it is important to not to invalidate client struggles. And instead of using the person-centered approach, I use the term person in the systems-centered approach. So this is collective care leading to self-care and culturally inquisitive fostering care. And I would suggest that to avoid CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, as a blanket practice, because it is individualized, whereas the issues are largely systemic. Number 6, this is Ubuntu, a West African proverb. I am because we are. And Dina Naeri, who has written a book about this as well, and this is one of the articles freely available in The Guardian. The ungrateful refugee, we have no debt to repay. So when I work with clients, I remind myself and all of us to unlearn the politics of thanking. I tell them, do not thank, because the expectation is to be grateful to Canada, grateful to service providers, grateful to this, grateful to all of these. And I say, no, you don't have to be grateful. Do not thank me. I am the one who should thank you. And so foster collective care, debunk the myth of independence. Independence rhetoric is such a myth, glorified myth. Embrace the truth of interdependence, which is also a foundational principle of indigenous worldviews. This from number 7. Okay, so here we visit that quote. I am amazed by the incredible resilience of LGBTQ+ newcomers. This I found on the internet, so which says this: I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or how many. Reflexive practice and research. This is one of the principles, 6-fold principles of integrated anti-oppression framework. This is also freely available online. So the last, this says, people who live with multiple marginalized identities do not merely face extra barriers. Their lived experience is entirely different. So that is such a profound statement, profound thinking to absorb and live in, especially if you are a researcher, if you are a frontline worker or practitioner. This is Sarah Ahmed, living a feminist life. I'm not willing to be included if inclusion means being included in a system that is unjust, violent, and unequal. Think about that. So this diversity, inclusion, business Sarah Ahmed takes to task in her Killjoy Manifesto. This is Principle 6. And it's important to disrupt like no other, because we are on a land that is being stolen from indigenous peoples. So this is a question to ask constantly through our work. How does our work legitimize the genocide of First Peoples? And it is important to situate our dreams, bodies, work, and research on the indigenous land. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for some truly remarkable presentations. They raised a lot of really compelling ideas and the results of your work. And I'd like to thank you very much for sharing them with us today. Deeply insightful and challenging. Let us move to some questions. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A yet, but anyone who is in the webinar, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A. To start, I'd like to dig in a bit with what you both had to say about how your work can affect frontline practice with newcomers. David, you talked a lot about making spaces safe. Ranjith, your very powerful quote about how LGBTQ plus people don't want to have to be resilient anymore. How can we make the spaces safer for them, like for us? And how can we, as people who have investment in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, how do we improve the systems that are holding so many people down and really causing violence to them?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my specific question is, could you go into a bit more detail about what you were suggesting about changes to make for frontline work?
Okay, David, would you like to go first?
After you, Ranjith.
Okay, so first of all, I don't use the word safe space anymore. Not a single space is safe. So instead, I use that I use the terms a kind space and a brave space. Without kindness, we do not move an inch forward. It comes from your heart. Kindness comes from your heart. So with kindness, we can be brave. We can make mistakes. We are all projects in progress. That's what I. So we make mistakes. I make mistakes a lot of the time. And when I make mistakes, I own it and make a commitment not to repeat the mistake again. So these are the things that make our people, LGBTQ plus refugees and newcomers, safer, or brave, and feel comfortable when they come to the space. And number two is that talk about resilience. There's research done on resilience of refugees and newcomers, and I'm not sure whether they have problematized enough the privilege, underlying power and privileges associated with this term and the expectation of resilience. Resilience is when you use up your energy of a lifetime within a matter of few months or few days even. That is what resilience means, that people who are in privileged positions take for granted. So I don't talk about resilience. Be lazy. When I do workshop, I say, just be lazy, do nothing. Because the whole expectations of indigenous black racialized bodies is to work. So I reverse the thinking, and these are, we discuss and we talk about taking these positions as our power, as our point of politics. So if you are pushed to the margins, take it as our point of politics. So that is where I come from, and then with that thinking, like for example, the ungrateful refugee. Why should refugees be grateful, and to whom? And if you look at the trail of refugee producing countries and refugee receiving countries, they are these developed countries, colonial and neo-colonial countries. They're going there and playing havoc, and people are displaced, and they come back to the same countries, and they use them to extract their labor. This is how capitalist systems work. This is how capitalism works. So that is where I sometimes tell them I am here not to propel your dreams, but I am a dream shatterer. Let's stop being eyes wide shut, eyes wide open. That is the point that I'm making. So, thanks. I don't know whether I answered your question, but yeah.
I think you did. I think what you said at the beginning, especially about kindness, so much of the work that we need to do is within ourselves. How are we going to act in ways that are respectful, that address any internal bias, that support people, make them feel comfortable? And I hear you also about not using the term safe space anymore. I've heard things called brave spaces, but kind spaces is definitely a concept that I will be thinking about more too. Thank you.
So I use the term safe. I use the term safer.
Yes.
Spaces, not safe as a, yeah.
Yeah, because we cannot guarantee that things will be safe. We're all human and we make mistakes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. David.
I think so. Of course, I'm not as eloquent as Ranjit with saying these things, but at the same time, just thinking of the structural level of like, so all the advice we can give is like how to make your individual one-on-one interactions safer, or those kinds of things, being reflexive. And I'll just acknowledge also the systems level that we're within, fighting for resources and funding and those kinds of things for programming, needing to see X number of clients per day or week and those kinds of things, meeting our hours. So I think at the structural level, advocating for like different measurement strategies of how we're pushing people in and out and not spending the time we need and the time people deserve, to just be heard and be like, oh, but my job is only to find secure employment. Okay, at the same time, that's not going to happen unless all these other things are going to be addressed, like needing to operate outside of sometimes your job, which is going to require structural. So I'm not going to ignore that that doesn't exist and you have to operate within your parameters. But then, so I'm just word vomiting here, but I mean, thinking like, who are we electing during election seasons and things like that, of like, who are you personally like voting for? And that has a direct impact on the populations who are most marginalized in our society. Thinking at that level, I was just jotting down some notes while Ranjit was talking, but so yeah, not teaching people to break laws, but at the same time, okay, yes, that's generally how we're supposed to operate when we're looking to apply for permanent residency or whatever. And at the same time, here are some ways to operate the system in, I'm just going to say, strategic ways that might not be what we're supposed to always be doing, even as workers ourselves. And so definitely not doing something that's going to compromise someone's situation. But yeah, just operating outside of sometimes guidelines for the purpose of like humanity, as opposed to just, well, this is my job. And I think we can become robotic in our jobs as social workers, social service providers, of just like script, become rote. But yeah, so trying to make things safer at more so like the structural level of advocating for like increased support, or advocating for changing the metrics that we're using, to be able to maybe be a bit more resistant to the how we treat people as individuals, which is not always how we should. But Yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Well, it's great that you brought that up, because that was going to be my next question. Moving from the individual in social work, we talk about the micro level to the meso and the macro level. So you've touched on what we can do more on the macro level to address the systems, because as Ranjit pointed out, so many of the systems are what oppress people and keep them from getting the employment, keep them from getting the social services and so forth. Yeah, and the limited access to social systems, to healthcare, to settlement services. If you don't have status as a permanent resident, as soon as you become a citizen, you lose all of that. Ranjit, I want to thank you for pointing out also how much the immigration status can affect what access to systems people have. That's something that's come up a lot in the work that we've done here at the Community Knowledge Program, and it has a tremendous effect on how well people are able to integrate, how well people are able to survive here, and we hope thrive here. Yeah. Okay, another question, and I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that we would love to hear you, hear your questions. There's one here from Dolores Mullings. We'd like to, she'd like to understand how Ubuntu is related to the general 2S LGBTQIA plus population, since this is an African concept and practice. Is it related specifically to Black 2S LGBTQIA plus peoples? And also talking about the piece about resilience. This is a pushback space that Black people have been holding specifically around strong and resilience. And she believes, as I do, that it's important that we're careful not to erase the labor and the tracks that Black folks have set out. Yeah.
Okay. You may have to explain the second part of the question, resilience, again to me, but I'll take the Ubuntu is, okay, when in the spaces that I'm working with, people are more like 80–90% of the LGBTQIA plus newcomers are from the African continent, Caribbean islands, and so on. Quite apart from that, I am because we are is a universally applicable principle. I come from Sri Lanka, and this principle in a different way is enshrined in our traditional systems. And it is related to interdependence. So I am using these universal, timeless, fundamental principles to recreate spaces of care, collective care. It's only collective care that leads to individual health and well-being. Collective care. In a society that is healthier, we can avoid so many issues, health issues, and so on. It is because of the systems are so unjust and sickly that they manifest in various individuals, especially those who are pushed into precarious situations. So that is what I'm drawing inspirations from. And the other question, can you explain it to me again?
From what I understand, and Dolores, if you would like to explain a bit more in the chat as well, if I don't get this right. I think what she's pointing out is that all the pushback against, or a lot of the pushback against the terms resilient, against the term strong, characterizing people as responsible for their own reactions to the oppressive systems rather than dismantling the oppressive systems themselves. Black folks have done a lot of work in this space already about pushback and resilience, and we must be careful not to erase that work. We need to acknowledge it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. And Dolores, if you have any more comments or questions about that, we would love to hear from you. Another question has come in about researcher positionality, and I had a question about this as well. What are the things to address? How do we recognize the privilege of the power position possessed by the researcher, at the same time connect with the people who are the experts of their own lives, but at the same time they're in the marginalized social positions in the society? And David, in your paper, I know you addressed some of this, so if you could speak a bit about that.
Sorry, I was just pressing the second part of the question there. So, of course, researcher positionality is something to always keep in the forefront, and especially writing my dissertation, I tried to weave it throughout of how my positionality, specifically as a white settler, is impacting this. So I went in thinking, oh, I'm studying employment among LGBT, gay, bisexual, queer people, specifically men. I was like, oh, I'm definitely more of an insider within this population. And at the same time, because of that economic insecurity, we know that it more representation among people of color as well as newcomers, which I do not identify with, was at play. So there's a lot of thinking through it. A big part of why I didn't focus on this in my primary analysis was because I wanted to make sure that I was doing this with a team that also would bring different viewpoints to the research and analysis that I wasn't going to be able to get at by doing this. And that's kind of why I also was setting up even this talk as like, these are springboards for further conversation, and it's not something that comes from a rich analysis that I've done solely as a one-person thing for a dissertation. That said, I did think it was important to address intersectional pieces throughout my dissertation. But I'm trying to post in the chat, but it's not showing. But anyway, Emily was referring to also a paper that I wrote on reflexivity, and especially thinking of people who are in settlement work. I'm going to transition it a little bit from researcher, but I will come back. Especially working in these spaces, like these stories are hard to hear time and time again. And a lot of settlement workers are people who might be newcomers themselves, might be LGBT people themselves. And we often think of like, okay, so what is our impact on other people? But hearing stories like this is also very impactful of how it's impacting us as service providers or those kinds of things. So myself as a researcher, my other program of research is on conversion therapy, and that's something that I have more insider status in. And so I talk about how being on the inside of research is often very hard. So I was kind of glad that I don't have a complete overlap with the population that I was working with, because it allowed me to distance a little bit, because that would have been very emotionally labor intensive. But at the same time, being mindful that participants would call it out in the interviews, and like we would talk about it at the same time of like, hey, I don't have the same experience. What does that mean when you say this? And people would talk about that, not just in terms of skin color, but my accent and having more of a Canadian accent as opposed to another type of accent. They talked about even just what we look like, right? If we look more presentable or not, and that might be coded in terms of whiteness, but it's also coded in terms of just like aesthetics and how people communicate and get along with other people. So there's a lot of aspects that people brought up. I got talked about. Even weight and size came up in the interviews of how the people relate to us. So it's not all just necessarily about newcomer status and race, but also about other aspects that I didn't think would necessarily come up, and I wasn't reflecting on before going into this research of how I presented outside of race. And maybe I was like, oh, I'm queer, whatever. But yeah, so there's a lot of aspects that I would talk about in interviews with participants, but also reflect on afterwards. And I had a committee of people that I would talk to about how I present in the research process shaped the research. But I'm going to stop there because I'm very mindful of the time, and I want to leave time for Ranjit as well.
Yeah, you cannot avoid yourself. You cannot avoid yourself in the sense your body, the way you present your gender, your positionalities when you do research or when you do frontline work. I remember being a service user because of what happened to me when I came to Canada. I became a service user and trying to navigate the very cis heteronormative mental health care system, and then reinventing myself and becoming a service provider. This transition, because I was looking at myself, like restoring my third eye and being mindful of how this transition gave me so much unearned power and privilege as a service provider. The moment you wear that hat, you become like an expert, and people come looking for you, asking you various questions, resources and referrals and so on. Unless you are constantly aware of those, you can perpetuate the same oppressions that you are trying to eradicate. So in terms of research, for research, your positionality is absolutely important to identify, document, journal. And I am even thinking of, my supervisor suggested that maybe I should include it in a separate chapter, my journey, because that is what I'm bringing in. And that colors the lens, colors my approach. We cannot be objective. We cannot be, there's another term, being non-judgmental. This is so much talked about. Try to be, you can never be non-judgmental. You can only be aware that you are being judgmental. So I don't use the terms being judgmental or try to be non-judgmental. I can only be aware, rigorously aware of the judgments I make constantly and how it impacts on the person that I'm working with. By the same token, I don't use the term I understand, because as one of the professors when I was studying mental health counseling said, you can never understand the other person, what the other person going through. So don't use the term I understand. I can maybe empathize, but I cannot understand. So these are the terms that I don't use when I say I understand. No, I don't understand. I can empathize.
Mhm. Okay, thank you both so much. We are a little bit over time. I very much appreciate your thoughts and your explorations of this very complex and nuanced issue. And I hope, I'm seeing some comments here. This has been very powerful, and I very much appreciate this conversation. And I hope that those who have joined today can take from this presentation and discussion thoughts and changes to their practice into their own work. Thank you again. And I would just like to mention that for access to our needs assessment and to resources from our events, you can sign up on the Community Knowledge Program webpage. I'm about to share the link in the chat. And we would like to thank everyone who has come today, and let you know that there will be one further webinar in March, which we will be sending out information on our mailing list about soon. So one more time, thank you again, Ranjit and David, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.